During the winter months of 1944, in the depths of Nazi-occupied Poland's deteriorating borders, a man found himself standing within the shadowy confines of a basement pharmacy. In his grasp were two glass vials, outwardly indistinguishable from one another. The first vial contained morphine, the conventional painkiller routinely supplied to injured SS officers stationed along the Eastern Front. The second vial, however, held something considerably more dangerous, a potent serum extracted from the venom of the European adder, a serpent whose strike could make blood feel like flames coursing beneath human skin. As the pharmacist positioned the venomous vial into a shipping container destined for a field hospital in Krakow, his hands remained steady, unwavering. His identity was Viktor Dankevych, a Ukrainian man of 42 years whose entire family had been wiped from existence half a year prior during a mass killing outside Lviv. The Nazis remained ignorant, completely unable to suspect that this unassuming individual who prepared their medical prescriptions had evolved into something far more threatening than any resistance fighter wielding firearms. He had transformed into their unseen executioner, and his weapon was pure knowledge. Prior to the war, reducing Viktor's existence to ashes, he had lived as an unremarkable man during what appeared to be unremarkable times. He operated a modest apothecary located in Lviv's Jewish quarter, an establishment handed down across 3 generations of Dankevych pharmacists. Local residents frequented his shop for treatments, and Viktor's standing for exactness had garnered him widespread respect throughout the city. Miriam, his wife, worked as a schoolteacher who instructed children in reading across 3 different languages. Leah, his daughter, merely 8 years of age, possessed her mother's eyes along with her father's meticulous hands. Their living quarters sat above the pharmacy in rooms permeated with the scent of dried herbs, combined with aged books. Dinner table discussions centered around Leah's educational progress and considerations about whether expanding the shop to include the corner building made sense. Viktor's existence was quantified through mortar and pestle work, through precisely calibrated formulas, through the fulfillment that came from providing healing. His belief rested in the supreme authority of precision, understanding that every individual grain of powder held significance, that chemical processes adhered to unbreakable laws. He maintained faith that the world functioned according to comparable principles of structure and logic. His belief proved catastrophically mistaken. The invasion arrived like an affliction, initially manifesting as whispered rumors, subsequently as explosions heard from afar, ultimately as military boots marching through streets beneath new banners displaying symbols resembling fractured crosses. Within mere weeks, the established rules shifted in manners that contradicted Viktor's comprehension of basic human decency. Warning signs materialized on storefront windows. Name lists appeared posted against walls. His neighbors started vanishing. One family initially, followed by another, then complete blocks emptied during nighttime hours, as though someone had swept through with cleaning tools. Viktor, along with his family, faced forced removal from their residence above the pharmacy, relocated into a congested ghetto where thousands became compressed into areas intended for hundreds. The pharmacy underwent seizure, transferred to a German administrator possessing no medical knowledge whatsoever, yet complete understanding regarding order compliance. Viktor received permission to maintain his work there, not through any act of compassion, but because the German military required someone genuinely comprehending which medications served which purposes. He became invisible workforce, merely a pair of capable hands connected to a physical form the Nazis regarded as subhuman. They failed to perceive him as dangerous precisely because they failed to perceive him as sufficiently human to represent any threat. The extermination directive arrived on a Tuesday morning during June of 1943, delivered with the bureaucratic precision characterizing the Nazi death machinery. Complete liquidation of the entire ghetto was mandated within a 48-hour window. Viktor was positioned at the pharmacy when gunfire sounds reached his ears, initially resembling firecracker noises that escalated into a continuous thunder, reverberating off Lviv's medieval architecture. He rushed through streets, transformed into execution zones, past bodies still exhibiting movement, past soldiers who produced laughter while reloading their weapons. His building had been reduced to a burning skeleton. His wife and daughter were located in a mass burial site along the city's outskirts, identifiable solely through the blue scarf Miriam had worn that particular morning, the very one Leah had presented to her as a birthday gift. Viktor released no scream. He did not crumble. Something within his core crystallized into a formation harder than diamond and exponentially more dangerous. When an SS officer discovered him wandering in proximity to the grave location and demanded explanation for his absence from his assigned workstation, Viktor merely offered a nod and returned to the pharmacy. However, the man completing this return was no longer identical to the man who had departed. The German administrators never developed suspicion that Viktor had initiated his own silent campaign. Their dependence on him ran too deep. The Eastern Front functioned as a grinding machine, devouring soldiers at rates surpassing comprehension, with field hospitals demanding continuous supplies of painkillers, antibiotics, along with sedatives. Viktor possessed access to everything required, and more critically, he possessed chemical knowledge his overseers completely lacked. His beginning was modest, substituting 10% of a morphine delivery with a mild emetic capable of inducing vomiting, though nothing lethal. He observed and remained patient. Nobody took notice. The system operated with excessive chaos, overwhelming disorganization. A handful of sick soldiers were simply chalked up to poor food quality or stress factors. Growing bolder, Viktor started examining the pharmacopoeia through transformed eyes, no longer as someone providing healing, but as an engineer of suffering. He investigated compounds, possessing the capacity to magnify pain instead of reducing it. He conducted experiments with proportions and administration techniques. Then, memory returned regarding a research paper he had studied years earlier concerning the venom of Vipera berus, the common European adder. Specifically, how its hemotoxic characteristics could achieve stabilization within solution form. Within a 6-month period, Viktor Dankevych had converted his basement working space into a retribution laboratory. He captured adders from woodland areas outside the city, extracted their venom, applying the identical precision he had previously employed for compounding healing tinctures, then created a serum displaying the appearance, scent, and precise viscosity matching pharmaceutical-grade morphine. The critical distinction was that upon injection, it would not diminish pain, but rather multiply it exponentially, converting every nerve ending into a pathway of torment while maintaining the victim's consciousness and awareness. SS officers receiving his specialized deliveries would plead for death inside field hospitals throughout Poland, their cries resonating through hallways as physicians desperately attempted comprehending why their painkillers functioned as torture instruments. Viktor maintained detailed documentation of every poisoned vial, every delivery, every projected casualty figure. His motivation was not forgiveness, which he never pursued, nor justice, which had ceased existing. His actions stemmed from understanding that within a world having stripped everything from him, the singular remaining power involved making monsters experience, even momentarily, a fraction of the pain they had imposed upon millions. Viktor Dankevych's transformation from healer into hunter did not occur through a solitary moment filled with rage or hopelessness, but rather evolved through a succession of deliberate decisions accumulating upon each other, resembling a meticulously constructed chemical equation. Throughout the months following the massacre consuming his family, Viktor discovered himself occupying a peculiar position involving simultaneous visibility combined with invisibility within the Nazi occupation machinery. The Germans observed him daily, delivered requisition documentation to him, shouted commands at him using fragmented Polish. Yet they never genuinely examined him as anything beyond a useful instrument, a living compendium of pharmaceutical understanding confined within a body they considered expendable. This blindness evolved into his primary advantage. While SS officers paraded through the pharmacy, insisting upon accelerated deliveries for field hospitals, while Wehrmacht quartermasters voiced complaints regarding supply deficiencies, Viktor maintained his position behind the counter, displaying the expressionless appearance of someone shattered by mourning. And their belief in what they observed stemmed from confirmation of their presumptions regarding the inferiority of those they had subjugated. They remained incapable of conceiving that this shuffling pharmacist, preparing their medications with such careful attention, was systematically analyzing their organizational framework, charting their distribution networks, and pinpointing the precise vulnerable points where a solitary individual possessing specialized understanding could generate maximum destruction. The operational security governing the Nazi medical distribution system proved, as Viktor uncovered, surprisingly vulnerable when examined from internal positions. Deliveries traveled through multiple inspection stations, but once a container received sealing and stamping with appropriate authorization markers, nobody challenged its contents. The operating assumption held that a Jewish pharmacist functioning under German oversight would experience excessive fear for attempting sabotage, monitored too carefully for success, even if attempted. This assumption achieved correctness regarding the first element and proved catastrophically incorrect regarding the second. Viktor's German supervisor, an elderly bureaucrat named Hermann Dieter Vogel, assigned to pharmaceutical supervision due to a cardiac condition preventing frontline duty, was an individual caring more deeply about documentation than medications. Vogel would arrive at the pharmacy at 9 o'clock each morning, examine requisition paperwork until midday, consume a 2-hour lunch involving considerable quantities of schnapps, return for signing shipping documents without reading them, then depart by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He never ventured into the basement laboratory where Viktor actually prepared the medications. He never confirmed shipment contents against inventory documentation. He simply presumed that fear, combined with routine, would maintain his subordinates' compliance. This arrangement provided Viktor with roughly 7 hours daily of completely unmonitored access to the comprehensive pharmaceutical distribution network serving the southern Polish operational theater. The technical obstacles involved in creating a weapon camouflaged as medicine were significant yet not impossible to overcome for someone possessing Viktor's training and available resources. The morphine sulfate, utilized by German field hospitals, arrived in standardized glass ampoules, each holding a specific concentration quantified in milligrams per milliliter, sealed using a distinctive crimped metal cap bearing the Reich Pharmaceutical Authority's stamp. Viktor required creating something capable of surviving visual examination, matching the weight and visual characteristics of legitimate morphine, yet transforming the pain relief process into a torture mechanism. The Venom of Vipera berus, the European adder, presented a nearly ideal answer. When appropriately processed and stabilized within a saline suspension, adder venom became a transparent, moderately viscous liquid, virtually impossible to distinguish from morphine sulfate solution. More significantly, its hemotoxic and neurotoxic characteristics generated a particular sequence of effects that, when introduced into human tissue, would produce the precise reverse of morphine's effects. Rather than blocking pain receptors throughout the nervous system, the venom would stimulate them. Rather than sedation, victims would undergo heightened consciousness of every physical sensation. Rather than the warm comfort desperately sought by wounded soldiers, they would receive liquid fire burning through their circulatory system, transforming their wounds into sources of amplified suffering. The initial test delivery departed the Lviv pharmacy during late September of 1943, headed for a field hospital supporting the 4th Panzer Army near Zhytomyr. Viktor had substituted precisely 12 ampoules within a crate containing 200, a proportion designed to generate maximum bewilderment while reducing the probability of immediate discovery. If every ampule contained poison, physicians would rapidly recognize something systematically wrong with the delivery. But 12 contaminated doses scattered among 188 legitimate ones would establish a pattern appearing random, attributable to contamination during manufacturing processes, storage difficulties, or numerous other explanations, failing to indicate deliberate sabotage directly. As Viktor sealed the container personally, applied the correct stamps along with shipping labels, then observed as German soldiers transferred it onto a truck without second thoughts. For 3 weeks he received no information, and the quietness consumed him with possibilities that his work had failed, that the venom had broken down during transportation, that somehow his calculations had been erroneous. Then, initial reports started filtering back through administrative pathways, encoded in the emotionless terminology of military bureaucracy, yet unmistakable regarding their meaning. Field Hospital 14 had documented unusual adverse responses to morphine delivery in 12 patients spanning a 2-week time frame, the memorandum indicated, with manifestations including extreme pain reactions, cardiovascular complications, tissue death at injection locations, and in 3 instances, death from what resembled anaphylactic shock. An inquiry into pharmaceutical quality oversight was suggested. Viktor examined the memo twice, memorized the figures, then incinerated it in the basement furnace, as he had received instructions for handling all administrative documentation after processing. 12 patients, 12 ampules, a flawless correlation. 3 fatalities meant 9 had survived the initial injection, signifying 9 SS officers had encountered something they had never previously experienced during their Reich service. Genuine powerlessness, confronting suffering, the variety of torment they had imposed on innumerable others, yet never conceived could be inflicted upon themselves. Viktor experienced no gratification, no feeling of victory. He felt solely a frigid mechanical assurance that his methodology functioned, that he had developed a weapon capable of operating within the enemy's personal logistics framework, and that he had scarcely commenced. The success of the initial contaminated delivery presented Viktor with a predicament that would have immobilized a man less driven by purpose. How to expand his operation without initiating a comprehensive inquiry that would reveal him and terminate his work before it could genuinely begin. The Nazi bureaucracy, despite all its cruelty, was capable of thorough organization when adequately motivated, and a sequence of poisoned medications could stimulate the variety of methodical examination that would follow every delivery back to its origin point. Viktor comprehended that he was functioning in a restricted zone between impact and discovery, that every contaminated ampule elevated both his effectiveness and his danger. He needed thinking not as a pharmacist, but as a tactician, to comprehend the psychology of his adversary sufficiently well for exploiting the deficiencies in their reasoning. The crucial realization came from an unanticipated source, a discussion he overheard between 2 Wehrmacht medical officers who had stopped at the pharmacy for collecting an urgent order of sulfur drugs. They were examining the disorder of the Eastern Front distribution system, how materials vanished constantly, how deliveries arrived damaged or incomplete, how the immense volume of casualties rendered accurate record-keeping virtually impossible. One officer expressed frustration that he had received bandages saturated in oil rather than the antiseptic solution he had requested, clearly a packaging mistake at some depot hundreds of kilometers distant. The other responded with laughter, stating this was characteristic, that you adapted to work with whatever arrived, because lodging complaints up the hierarchy accomplished nothing except drawing unwanted scrutiny from officers seeking someone for blame assignment. This discussion revealed the fundamental vulnerability Viktor needed to leverage. The Nazi military medical framework was suffocating in its personal logistical intricacy, and frontline staff had adapted to regard supply difficulties as routine irritations instead of sabotage indicators. If Viktor distributed his contaminated deliveries across multiple field hospitals, diversified the quantities and scheduling, and guaranteed that legitimate medications vastly exceeded poisoned ones, the pattern would disintegrate into background static. Each occurrence would be processed as an isolated quality control breakdown, examined locally, then abandoned as physicians progressed to the subsequent crisis. The system operated with excessive overwhelm for connecting dispersed data elements across hundreds of kilometers of battle lines. Viktor started charting the complete southern distribution infrastructure using requisition documentation and shipping records for identifying which field hospitals served which units, how frequently they requested morphine, and which pathways the deliveries traveled. He developed a mental information system of objectives, a rotation timetable that would guarantee no individual location received contaminated ampules more frequently than once every 2 months. He determined proportions based on hospital dimensions. Larger establishments could accommodate more poison doses without activating warnings, while smaller forward medical stations demanded more cautious quantities. By November of 1943, Viktor had broadened his Venom manufacturing operation to industrial proportions, or, at minimum, as industrial as one individual working in a basement could accomplish. He had located 3 deserted buildings within the ruins of the former Jewish quarter, where he could securely capture and maintain adders during brief intervals before processing their venom. The serpents were remarkably plentiful in the wild lots and demolished structures that the Nazis had emptied of people yet left otherwise undisturbed, as though even nature was reclaiming territories where humans had been eliminated. Viktor would venture forth before sunrise, wearing protective gloves and transporting a modified pharmacy satchel for collecting specimens that he would move back to his laboratory in sealed receptacles. The extraction procedure was delicate and time-consuming. Each serpent could yield only minuscule venom quantities, necessitating Viktor to sustain a rotating collection of specimens that he would milk, allow rest, then milk again, following a precisely timed schedule. He modified equipment from the pharmacy itself, employing altered syringes and collection containers, working by candlelight for avoiding attention from patrols that periodically swept the zone. The work carried danger, not solely because of the serpents, but because discovery would guarantee immediate execution. Yet, Viktor discovered a peculiar tranquility in the repetitive actions, the scientific exactness demanded to convert living venom into stabilized serum. The processing method Viktor developed originated from years of pharmaceutical education, combined with urgent innovation. Adder venom in its unprocessed state was excessively unstable for his requirements, decomposing rapidly at ambient temperature and forfeiting potency within hours of extraction. He required creating a formula that would maintain activity through weeks of storage and transportation, that would endure the temperature variations of military distribution networks, that would preserve its chemical characteristics until the injection moment. Through experimentation and error, utilizing expired medications from the pharmacy's rear inventory as test materials, Viktor uncovered that combining the venom with a particular proportion of saline solution, trace quantities of albumin for stabilizing the proteins, and a precisely measured amount of sodium citrate as a preservation agent, generated a serum that could sustain viability for up to 6 weeks. He evaluated his batches on tissue specimens, on laboratory mice he captured in the storage chamber, and ultimately on himself in regulated microdoses for confirming that the pain reaction matched his theoretical estimations. The self-experimentation left him with profound comprehension of exactly what he was imposing on his targets. A sensation he characterized in his concealed journal as experiencing like every cell in the affected zone was being simultaneously crushed and incinerated, a pain so overwhelming that it eliminated every other thought and reduced awareness to pure suffering. By the conclusion of 1943, Viktor Dankevych had successfully contaminated 27 separate deliveries across 14 different field hospitals, Substituting a sum of 143 morphine ampules with his Venom serum, he maintained no written documentation of his sabotage, instead preserving a mental count that he reviewed each night before permitting himself 3 hours of rest. The calculations of his silent campaign were exact. Presuming each contaminated ampule was administered to a different patient and projecting a 30% mortality rate based on the restricted feedback he obtained through administrative pathways, Viktor calculated he had eliminated roughly 43 SS and Wehrmacht personnel and caused severe suffering to precisely 100 others. These figures should have resembled justice, like substantial resistance against a genocidal authority. Instead, they resembled droplets of water against an ocean of blood, completely insufficient, evaluated against the millions the Nazis had slaughtered, including the 2 individuals who had been his complete world. But Viktor persisted, because persistence was the singular option remaining to him, because halting would signify acknowledging that his work was without meaning, and because deep in the basement of a confiscated pharmacy in occupied Poland, making monsters cry out was the only supplication he had remaining. The winter of 1944 delivered both enhanced opportunity and existential peril to Viktor's operation as the Eastern Front started disintegrating under the pressure of Soviet counteroffensives that drove the Wehrmacht into disorganized withdrawal. The German military medical framework, already strained beyond capacity, descended into absolute disorder as field hospitals were hurriedly evacuated, supply centers abandoned, and complete logistics infrastructures severed by rapidly advancing Red Army formations. For Viktor, this disorder was paradoxically ideal. Requisition requests flooded into the Lviv pharmacy at triple the earlier rate as frantic medical officers rushed to accumulate supplies before evacuation pathways closed entirely. Hermann Vogel, his nominal supervisor, had evolved into little beyond a rubber stamp, authorizing documents without even pretending to examine them, as he dedicated most of his time planning his personal escape westward. The pharmacy's basement evolved into a production facility of death, operating at peak output, with Viktor preparing contaminated deliveries during extended sessions lasting 18 to 20 hours. Sustained exclusively by stolen amphetamines from the pharmacy's inventory and the crystalline concentration that came from understanding his operational window was rapidly narrowing. He comprehended that the Soviet progression would eventually capture Lviv, that the Germans would either evacuate him as valuable workforce or eliminate him as unnecessary burden, and that either result would terminate his capability to poison the Reich's wounded. This consciousness transformed his work from a prolonged campaign into a frantic race to generate maximum destruction before the conclusion arrived. The magnitude of suffering Viktor enabled during those final months surpassed his initial projections and exceeded anything he had envisioned possible when first conceptualizing his plan. He was now contaminating deliveries at a proportion of 1 poisoned ampule for every 8 legitimate ones. A drastically elevated percentage that he recognized increased his danger of discovery, yet which appeared warranted given the contracting timeline. The field hospitals receiving his deliveries were themselves in perpetual movement, withdrawing westward in phases, signifying that contaminated morphine was being dispersed across an ever-expanding geographic zone as supplies were merged, reallocated, and transported to new positions. Viktor's venom was propagating through the German medical framework like a pathogen, transporting his silent retribution to field hospitals in eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and even Austria, as the Wehrmacht retreated toward the Reich's pre-war boundaries. The accounts that filtered back through administrative pathways, when they arrived at all, illustrated a picture of methodical crisis. Multiple hospitals documenting adverse reactions to morphine. Physicians questioning whether an entire manufacturing batch had been contaminated at the origin. Medical officers insisting upon investigations that were immediately deprioritized because the army possessed more urgent concerns than pharmaceutical quality oversight. Viktor read one memorandum that crossed his desk in January of 1945, composed by a frustrated Surgeon General, estimating that morphine-related complications had generated roughly 300 unexpected casualties across the southern theater throughout the previous 6 months. Though the author attributed this to compromised storage circumstances instead of sabotage. 300. Viktor had never envisioned his work would attain that magnitude. The psychological burden of his actions started manifesting in manners Viktor had not foreseen, generating a peculiar duality in his awareness between the individual who systematically prepared death and the individual who lay wakeful at night, confronting what he had evolved into. There were instances, typically in the depths of early morning, when exhaustion removed his protections, when Viktor would hold one of his prepared ampoules up to the faint light of a candle and genuinely comprehend what it signified. Some youthful German soldier, perhaps no older than 20, wounded by shrapnel or projectiles, being transported into a field hospital where overextended physicians would inject him with what they perceived as relief from torment. The soldier would possess a mother somewhere, possibly siblings, potentially a romantic interest, awaiting correspondence that would ultimately cease arriving. In the theoretical mathematics of warfare, this soldier represented the adversary, an element of the apparatus that had slaughtered Viktor's family and millions of others. But in the particular reality of that injection instant, he was merely a human being whose suffering would be magnified beyond comprehension by Viktor's meticulous chemistry. These reflections did not prevent Viktor from preparing the subsequent batch or the one following that, but they left him with a hollowness that felt like his essence had been excavated and substituted with something harder and more frigid. He comprehended that he had traversed a boundary that separated the individual he had been from the individual he had evolved into, and that no quantity of justice or vengeance could transport him back across that dividing line. He was condemned not by the ethics of his objectives, but by the straightforward act of selecting to impose suffering as a weapon, and he embraced this condemnation as the cost of his resistance. The closest Viktor approach to discovery transpired in early February of 1945, when a new officer arrived at the pharmacy for conducting what he termed a routine supply examination. Obersturmführer Klaus Richter was youthful, driven, and possessed the dangerous characteristic of genuinely caring about procedural adherence in an organization that had substantially abandoned such considerations in favor of survival. Richter dedicated 3 days examining inventory documentation, comparing shipping records against requisition requests, physically tallying ampoules in storage, and posing pointed inquiries about inconsistencies that Vogel had never observed or concerned himself about. Viktor preserved his persona of the shattered obedient subordinate, responding to questions in single syllables, moving through the pharmacy with the shuffling movement of someone who had been psychologically demolished. He displayed to Richter the basement laboratory, the preparation zone, the storage installations, all while his heart pounded against his ribcage with the awareness that a single, misplaced container, one contaminated ampoule positioned in the incorrect location, would reveal everything. Richter examined the morphine inventory with particular focus, holding ampoules up to the illumination, inspecting seals, even proceeding so far as to open one and smell its contents. Viktor stood 2 meters distant, calculating whether he could access the scalpel on the adjacent preparation surface before Richter could extract his sidearm, whether he could eliminate the officer quietly enough for avoiding attracting the guards positioned outside, whether he possessed the physical capacity to murder another human being with his hands, even if the opportunity materialized. But Richter ultimately positioned down the ampoule, made some entries in his inspection documentation, and proclaimed the pharmacy's operations satisfactory within acceptable parameters given present wartime circumstances. He never understood how proximate he had come to discovering evidence that would have resulted in Viktor's execution and the revelation of the most successful act of individual sabotage in the complete Polish resistance. The conclusion of Viktor's operation arrived not through discovery, but through evacuation. As the Soviet progression finally reached Lviv's outskirts in mid-February of 1945, the German authorities commanded the pharmacy stripped of all valuable supplies and equipment for transportation westward, with Viktor designated for relocation to an installation in Krakow, where his pharmaceutical proficiency would continue serving the Reich's disintegrating war effort. He was allocated 4 hours for packing essential materials and preparing for departure under supervision by 2 Wehrmacht soldiers who appeared far more concerned about their personal survival than about monitoring a middle-aged pharmacist. Those 4 hours signified Viktor's final opportunity for amplifying his work, and he approached the assignment with the concentrated intensity of an individual who comprehended he would never possess another chance. He prepared a final batch of contaminated ampules, his largest yet, substituting morphine in every single container scheduled for evacuation. 57 vials of concentrated venom dispersed across multiple containers. Each one, a small explosive of suffering that would activate in some unknown field hospital days or weeks in the future. Viktor packed them personally, sealed the containers, applied the shipping labels, then observed as German soldiers transferred his final contribution to the Reich onto trucks that would transport his vengeance deeper into the core of the dying Nazi empire. As the convoy prepared for departing Lviv, Viktor took one final look at the pharmacy, where he had transformed himself from healer into hunter, and he experienced nothing at all. The relocation to Krakow should have signified the conclusion of Viktor's capability to conduct his private campaign. But the final months of the Third Reich generated circumstances so anarchic that an individual with his particular capabilities could continue functioning in the disorder like a phantom moving through collapsing architecture. The pharmaceutical installation in Krakow was less a functioning operation than a frantic salvage attempt, assembled from evacuated supplies, staffed by a rotating collection of personnel who arrived one week and vanished the next as units were redeployed or simply abandoned their positions. Viktor was assigned to a basement working space that resembled an echo of his Lviv laboratory, provided access to stockpiles of medications that had been consolidated from a dozen different origins and essentially left unmonitored because the skeleton crew of German administrators possessed far more immediate concerns than supervising a pharmacist's daily activities. The installation's commanding officer, a captain named Ernst Weber, who had been wounded at Stalingrad and reassigned to logistics responsibility, visited the basement precisely once for confirming Viktor comprehended his responsibilities, then never returned. This neglect was both a blessing and a revelation. Viktor realized that in the death throes of the Nazi regime, he had evolved into functionally invisible, a piece of bureaucratic debris that the system was too disorganized to appropriately control, yet too desperate to eliminate. He initiated his work again within 48 hours of arrival, this time with even fewer limitations than before. The morphine inventory in Krakow came from origins across the fragmenting Reich, consolidated deliveries that represented the final remnants of a medical logistics infrastructure that had once encompassed a continent. Viktor discovered containers bearing labels from installations in Berlin, Vienna, Budapest, even some marked with French pharmaceutical stamps that suggested they had been plundered from occupied territories years earlier. This geographic diversity signified that any contamination Viktor introduced would disperse across an unpredictable network of destinations impossible to follow back to a solitary origin. He modified his method to the new environment, working more rapidly and with reduced caution because the conclusion was apparent. The war was ending, the Reich was disintegrating, and whether Viktor was discovered next week or next month mattered less than maximizing his impact during whatever time remained. He established a manufacturing rhythm that permitted him to process venom and prepare contaminated ampules during night shifts when the installation was virtually deserted, storing his work among legitimate supplies in a system so disordered that inventory oversight had evolved into purely theoretical. The adders he required were more challenging to locate in urban Krakow than they had been in Lviv's ruins. But Viktor discovered a surprising population inhabiting the overgrown gardens of abandoned estates in the city's periphery, properties whose owners had either escaped westward or been eliminated in the general carnage. What Viktor did not understand, could not have understood during those final months, was the comprehensive scope of what his contaminated morphine was accomplishing across the disintegrating German medical infrastructure. The 57 ampules he had prepared during his final hours in Lviv had been dispersed to field hospitals in Breslau, Dresden, and Prague, arriving precisely as these installations were being overwhelmed by casualties from desperate defensive engagements. The additional hundreds of ampules Viktor prepared in Krakow between February and April of 1945 discovered their way into a medical framework that had descended into absolute dysfunction, where supplies were being reallocated almost arbitrarily as hospitals evacuated ahead of advancing Allied forces. A solitary contaminated delivery from Krakow ended up in a converted schoolhouse functioning as a field hospital outside Berlin, where it was administered on wounded SS officers from the Nordland Division during the final struggle for the Reich's capital. Another delivery reached a hospital train, evacuating casualties westward toward the American lines, where the screaming bewilderment of men being tortured by their personal painkillers contributed to the general disorder of Germany's collapse. The venom Viktor had synthesized in basement laboratories in Lviv and Krakow was propagating through the Reich's final days like a malediction, converting moments of anticipated relief into episodes of inexplicable torment, making the final weeks of wounded Nazi soldiers into previews of whatever damnation awaited them. The liberation of Krakow by Soviet forces in late April of 1945 discovered Viktor in his basement laboratory, preparing what he somehow understood would be his final batch of contaminated ampules. The sounds of artillery had been intensifying for days. The German personnel had mostly escaped westward during the previous night, and Viktor had remained because he possessed nowhere else to proceed and nothing else to accomplish except continue his work until continuation became impossible. When Red Army soldiers finally descended the stairs and discovered him standing among rows of glass containers and laboratory apparatus, they initially presumed he was a German pharmacist and nearly executed him on the spot. Viktor's fluent Russian, learned from his mother who had been born in Kiev, rescued his life in those initial confused moments. His explanation of what he had been accomplishing in the basement, delivered in calm, factual terminology to a Soviet political officer who arrived hours later, was received with a combination of incredulity and somber admiration. The officer, a major named Grigory Volkov, who had dedicated 3 years fighting across the Eastern Front, comprehended immediately what Viktor's operation represented, not merely resistance, but a form of retribution so personal and so flawlessly calibrated for exploiting the adversary's assumptions that it transcended conventional sabotage and evolved into something approaching art. Volkov commanded the basement laboratory preserved precisely as it existed, photographed the apparatus and remaining supplies, and collected detailed statements from Viktor regarding his techniques, his objectives, and his projected impact. The figures that ultimately emerged from Soviet intelligence examination of Viktor's operation were both exact and devastating in their implications. Working backward from German medical documentation captured in Krakow, cross-referenced with accounts from other liberated installations, Soviet analysts projected that Viktor Dankevych had successfully contaminated roughly 800 morphine ampules throughout an 18-month interval between late 1943 and April of 1945. Presuming an 80% utilization rate, accounting for ampules that might have been destroyed or lost during transit. This translated to approximately 640 German military personnel who received injections of adder venom instead of morphine. with a projected fatality rate of 35% based on documented instances and a severe injury rate approaching 90% among survivors. The analysis determined that one pharmacist functioning alone in basement laboratories had eliminated between 200 and 250 Nazi soldiers and caused severe lasting destruction to roughly 400 more. These casualty figures were comparable to the impact of a successful partisan assault or a well-executed sabotage operation involving dozens of resistance fighters, except Viktor had achieved them while standing behind a pharmacy counter, had never discharged a weapon, and had functioned for 18 months without discovery. The Soviet report, classified and archived in Moscow's military repositories, described Viktor Dankevych's operation with clinical exactness, but observed in its conclusion that the psychological dimension of his work, the transformation of healing into torture, the weaponization of trust itself, signified a form of resistance that was perhaps more devastating than the raw figures suggested, because it had converted the Nazis' personal medical framework into an instrument of their suffering. The immediate aftermath of liberation left Viktor in a peculiar state of suspension, alive yet unmoored from any recognizable future. Free yet uncertain what freedom signified for an individual who had dedicated 18 months transforming himself into a living weapon. The Soviet authorities, now controlling Krakow, were initially uncertain what to accomplish with him, cycling through various proposals that ranged from recruiting him for intelligence work to prosecuting him for collaboration based on his employment under German supervision. Major Volkov evolved into something of an unofficial advocate, arguing that Viktor's operation represented precisely the variety of resourceful resistance the Soviet Union celebrated in its propaganda, though he acknowledged the methods were too dark and too individualistic to ever receive public promotion. Viktor himself appeared indifferent to these bureaucratic deliberations, dedicating his days in a small chamber above a bakery that the Soviets had requisitioned for displaced individuals, staring at walls and sleeping 12 to 14 hours at a time, as though his body was finally acknowledging the exhaustion he had suppressed for years. When questioned about his plans, about whether he wanted to remain in Poland or relocate to Soviet-controlled territory, about what he might accomplish now that the war was ending, Viktor would simply shake his head and state he had not contemplated that far ahead, which was accurate in a manner that extended deeper than the Soviets comprehended. He had never anticipated surviving his operation, had constructed no mental framework for a future beyond the work. And now that the work was finished, he discovered he had evolved into an individual without purpose or desire. The full comprehension of what Viktor had accomplished started to crystallize only when Soviet military intelligence initiated correlating German medical documentation with his documented contamination timetable, a procedure that consumed months and revealed patterns that shocked even hardened Red Army officers. Field hospitals across the former Eastern Territories had documented mysterious morphine reactions throughout 1944 and early 1945. But these accounts had been scattered across dozens of installations and archived in different administrative frameworks, never aggregated into a comprehensive picture. When Soviet analysts assembled the complete data collection, they discovered themselves examining a map of suffering that stretched from Poland to Austria, from Czechoslovakia to Berlin's outskirts, a geographic dispersal that appeared impossible for a solitary individual operating from basement laboratories. The clustering of occurrences around particular time intervals corresponded precisely with Viktor's contaminated deliveries, generating a documented chain of cause and effect that left no space for coincidence. More disturbing from a purely medical perspective were the detailed casualty accounts from German physicians who had tried desperately to comprehend why their morphine was eliminating patients, describing manifestations that matched adder envenomation with such exactness that Soviet toxicologists immediately recognized the work of someone with sophisticated pharmaceutical education. One account from a field hospital in Breslau, composed by a German surgeon in January of 1945, described a patient who had been injected with morphine after sustaining shrapnel wounds and had immediately commenced screaming that his blood was boiling, that someone had introduced acid into his veins, that he was being incinerated alive from the interior. The surgeon had attempted every available treatment, including multiple doses of additional morphine, which only magnified the torment before the patient ultimately died after 6 hours of continuous suffering. The account concluded with a desperate request for inquiry into medication quality oversight, a request that was archived and abandoned as the hospital evacuated ahead of Soviet forces 3 weeks later. What haunted Viktor during the summer of 1945, as he gradually emerged from his initial shutdown and started processing what he had accomplished, was not remorse over the casualties he had generated, but rather the discovery that he experienced nothing at all about them. He had anticipated experiencing satisfaction, or at minimum closure, the sense that he had accomplished some measure of justice for Miriam and Leah and the innumerable others the Nazis had slaughtered. Instead, he experienced only emptiness, a hollowness where emotions should have existed, as though the act of transforming himself into an instrument of retribution had demanded burning out whatever capacity for feeling he had once possessed. A Soviet psychiatrist who interviewed him in June as part of a study on resistance survivors observed in his account that Viktor displayed classic manifestations of profound dissociation, describing his personal actions in the detached tone of someone recounting a technical procedure rather than a campaign of deliberately imposed suffering. When asked directly whether he regretted what he had accomplished, Viktor contemplated for a long moment before responding that regret implied a choice, and he was not certain he had ever genuinely chosen anything after the moment he discovered his family in that mass grave. Everything that followed had been less a decision than an inevitable chemical reaction, one substance combining with another to generate a predetermined result. The psychiatrist discovered this response deeply unsettling and recommended ongoing observation, but the recommendation was archived alongside thousands of other post-war accounts and never implemented. The Soviet government ultimately decided to resettle Viktor in Kiev, his mother's birthplace, with a modest pension and a fabricated employment history that described him as a pharmaceutical worker who had served the Red Army during the occupation. This fiction was necessary because the truth of Viktor's operation was too complicated for the Soviet narrative of wartime resistance, which preferred stories of heroic partisans fighting in forests rather than silent pharmacists committing acts of calculated biological warfare. Viktor accepted the relocation without objection and dedicated the subsequent several years working in a civilian pharmacy, preparing prescriptions for antibiotics and cardiac medication. Inhabiting a modest apartment that he shared with nobody, his neighbors understood him as a courteous but distant individual who maintained privacy, who never discussed the war unless directly questioned, and even then provided only the minimal details. He joined no social organizations, established no close friendships, and demonstrated no interest in remarrying, despite well-intentioned attempts by local matchmakers to arrange meetings with war widows. On the surface, Viktor Dankevych had successfully reintegrated into civilian existence, evolving into another anonymous figure in a Soviet city filled with individuals attempting to forget the horrors of the previous decade. But those who understood him well, and there were extremely few, could perceive that he remained fundamentally absent, that the individual who moved through Kiev's streets and operated the mortar and pestle in his pharmacy was essentially a phantom, a consciousness inhabiting a body, yet not genuinely present in the world. The one behavior that marked Viktor as different from other war survivors was his absolute refusal to work with any form of pain medication, a restriction he insisted upon when accepting his post-war pharmacy position, and which he preserved with inflexible determination throughout his remaining years. He would compound antibiotics, prepare cardiac medications, combine cough syrups and digestive treatments, but he would not handle morphine or any of its derivatives, would not even remain in the chamber when another pharmacist prepared such medications. When his supervisor questioned this restriction, Viktor explained simply that he had developed a severe allergic sensitivity during the war and could not risk exposure, a falsehood that was accepted because nobody possessed any reason to doubt it. The truth, which Viktor articulated only once in a letter he composed but never dispatched to Major Volkov, was that he could not endure preparing substances intended to diminish suffering because his hands preserved the muscle memory of weaponizing relief, and he no longer trusted himself to maintain the distinction between healing and harm. The letter, discovered among Viktor's possessions after his death, contained a solitary sentence that revealed more than all the Soviet psychiatrists' accounts combined. He had written that every time he examined a vial of transparent liquid, he perceived not medicine, but the crystallized form of his personal damnation, and he would not impose that vision on anyone else, not even those who deserved their pain. The full magnitude of Viktor Dankevych's operation remained concealed from public awareness for decades. Buried in classified Soviet archives, alongside thousands of other wartime operations deemed too sensitive or too morally ambiguous for official histories. The Soviet government possessed no interest in publicizing a story that celebrated individual action over collective resistance, that depicted a Jewish pharmacist rather than communist partisans as the protagonist, and that involved methods which could not be easily reconciled with the heroic narratives of the Great Patriotic War. Viktor himself never spoke publicly about his wartime activities, preserving the fiction of his fabricated employment history. Even when interviewed in the 1,960 seconds by researchers documenting civilian experiences during the Nazi occupation, he would describe working in a pharmacy under German supervision, acknowledge the hardships and horrors he witnessed, mention that he lost his family to the massacres in Lviv, but deflect any questions about whether he engaged in resistance activities with vague statements about accomplishing what little he could to survive. Those who interviewed him departed with the impression of an individual who had endured the war through passive compliance rather than active resistance, which was precisely the impression Viktor intended to generate. The truth remained locked behind his emotionless exterior, understood only to a handful of Soviet intelligence officers who were bound by classification protocols and who possessed no reason to challenge the official silence. The breaking point in Viktor's carefully preserved anonymity came not from his personal actions, but from the gradual declassification of German military medical documentation. Beginning in the early 1970 seconds, as both Western and Soviet archives initiated releasing wartime documents for historical investigation, a West German medical historian named Dr. Heinrich Brandt, studying the collapse of Nazi military healthcare during the final years of the war, observed an unusual pattern in field hospital accounts from the Eastern Front. Scattered references to severe adverse reactions to morphine administration clustered in time and geography in manners that contradicted random distribution. Brandt initially presumed he had discovered evidence of a contaminated manufacturing batch or compromised storage circumstances. But as he compiled more data from archives in Bonn, Vienna, and ultimately Moscow, the pattern evolved too particular to attribute to accident. The contaminated ampules appeared exclusively in morphine deliveries to installations serving the southern Eastern Front between late 1943 and April of 1945. Originated from a small number of pharmaceutical distribution points, and generated manifestations consistent with venom exposure rather than medication degradation. Brandt published his discoveries in 1976 Inches, a technical medical journal determining that some form of systematic sabotage had transpired, but acknowledging he possessed no evidence about who was responsible or how it had been executed. The article was examined by fewer than 200 specialists and generated minimal attention in mainstream historical circles. But one of those readers was Major Grigory Volkov, now retired and inhabiting Moscow, who recognized immediately that someone had discovered the fingerprints of Viktor Danevych's operation. Volkov confronted a decision that carried both personal and political weight: whether to come forward with information that would resolve Brandt's historical puzzle but potentially expose Viktor to unwanted attention and legal complications. The Soviet Union in 1976 was far different from the Soviet Union of 1945, but classification protocols remained in effect, and unauthorized disclosure of intelligence operations could still result in serious consequences. After weeks of internal deliberation, Volkov selected a middle pathway. He wrote directly to Brandt through academic channels, providing carefully curated information that confirmed the sabotage was deliberate and the work of a solitary individual, but withholding Viktor's identity and particular operational details. Volkov described the perpetrator only as a Polish pharmacist who had lost his family to Nazi atrocities and who had employed his technical understanding to contaminate morphine deliveries, projecting the total casualty impact at 200 to 250, eliminated and several hundred more severely injured. He provided sufficient detail to validate Brandt's medical analysis while preserving sufficient ambiguity to protect Viktor's identity. Brandt incorporated this information into a revised article published in 1977, which generated considerably more attention than his initial technical piece. Appearing in historical journals and ultimately being cited in broader studies of resistance activities during World War II. The unnamed Pharmacist evolved into a footnote in the larger story of anti-Nazi resistance, an intriguing but minor detail in histories that concentrated on more dramatic acts of sabotage and partisan warfare. Viktor learned about Brandt's investigation, not through official channels, but by accident, when a young history student visiting his pharmacy in Kiev mentioned she was composing a thesis on medical aspects of the Eastern Front and inquired if he understood anything about a case of morphine sabotage that had been recently documented in Western literature. Viktor's face, according to the student's later recollection, went completely expressionless for several seconds before he simply shook his head and stated he understood nothing about such matters, that his wartime work had been purely administrative. But that evening, Viktor composed a letter to Major Volkov, the first communication between them in over 30 years, inquiring whether the protection of anonymity would continue or whether he should prepare for exposure. Volkov's response, which arrived 3 weeks later, assured Viktor that his identity would remain classified under Soviet protocols and that the Western investigation had reached the limits of what archival evidence could reveal without cooperation from Soviet sources, cooperation that would not be forthcoming. Volkov added in a handwritten postscript that was not part of the official typed letter that he believed Viktor's operation deserved full historical recognition, but comprehended why Viktor might prefer the silence. He closed by stating that whatever Viktor decided about his legacy, Volkov would respect that decision and employ whatever influence he retained to protect it. The question of legacy troubled Viktor more profoundly than he had anticipated, opening emotional channels that had been sealed for decades. He initiated, for the first time since the war, to seriously contemplate what his 18 months of deliberate poisoning signified beyond the immediate tactical impact, what it communicated about the nature of resistance and the costs of fighting evil with methods that were themselves morally compromised. He filled notebooks with thoughts he shared with nobody, exploring questions that possessed no clear answers. Whether inflicting suffering on wounded soldiers, even Nazi soldiers, was fundamentally different from the atrocities those soldiers had enabled, whether his actions had honored the memory of Miriam and Leah or had simply added more darkness to a world already saturated with violence, whether an individual who weaponized healing could ever genuinely claim the moral high ground, regardless of the justice of his cause. These were not abstract philosophical exercises, but deeply personal interrogations of his personal essence, attempts to comprehend what he had evolved into, and whether redemption was even a meaningful concept for someone who had crossed the thresholds he had crossed. Viktor never reached definitive answers to these questions, but the act of posing them appeared to restore some dimension of humanity that had been absent since liberation, as though confronting the moral complexity of his actions permitted him to finally acknowledge their full weight. He remained convinced that his operation had been necessary, that he would make the identical choices again under the identical circumstances. But he also initiated comprehending that necessity and righteousness were not synonyms, and that carrying the burden of necessary evil was its personal form of suffering, less dramatic than what he had imposed on his objectives, but perhaps more enduring. Viktor Dankevych died in 1983, at the age of 81, succumbing to complications from pneumonia in a Kiev hospital, where the nurses understood him only as a retired pharmacist who possessed no living relatives and few visitors. His death was silent and unremarkable, noted in a brief obituary in the local Pharmacy Association newsletter that mentioned his decades of service to the community, but made no reference to his wartime activities. The small apartment where he had inhabited for nearly 4 decades was cleared by municipal authorities, and his possessions catalogued according to standard procedures for deceased individuals without heirs. Most of what Viktor owned was mundane: clothing, basic furniture, a small collection of pharmaceutical reference books, kitchen implements that demonstrated little use. But packed in a locked metal container at the rear of his bedroom closet, the authorities discovered something that would ultimately rewrite the historical comprehension of one individual's private campaign against the Third Reich. The container held 17 notebooks filled with Viktor's meticulous handwriting, documenting in excruciating detail every aspect of his operation, from the first contaminated delivery in September of 1943 through his final batch in April of 1945. There were technical observations on venom extraction and stabilization, shipping records with coded marks indicating which containers had been contaminated, maps displaying the locations of field hospitals he had targeted, and most devastatingly, a day-by-day accounting of his projected casualties, complete with calculations of dosage, projected mortality rates, and coldly rational assessments of operational effectiveness. The discovery of Viktor's notebooks generated an immediate predicament for Soviet authorities, who were notified by the municipal workers who discovered them. The documents were clearly of historical significance, but they also contained detailed evidence of activities that had never been officially acknowledged and which raised uncomfortable questions about what the Soviet government had understood about Viktor's operation and when they had understood it. After consultation with multiple levels of bureaucracy, the decision was made to classify the notebooks and transfer them to the KGB archives in Moscow, where they joined the original intelligence accounts compiled by Major Volkov in 1945. This might have been the conclusion of the story, the final burial of Viktor Dankevych's legacy in the classified depths of Soviet state security, except for a historical accident that nobody could have predicted. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the subsequent disorder in the Russian intelligence apparatus led to partial declassification of numerous wartime archives, not through official policy, but through simple organizational breakdown. As underfunded and demoralized, archivists lost the capability to preserve strict classification protocols. Viktor's notebooks were photographed by a researcher in 1993 during a brief window when access restrictions had effectively ceased to exist, and copies initiated, circulating among academic historians specializing in Holocaust studies and resistance movements. The publication in 1995 of a comprehensive analysis of Viktor's operation based on his personal documentation, cross-referenced with German medical documentation and Soviet intelligence assessments, transformed him overnight from a historical footnote into one of the most successful individual saboteurs of World War II. The figures were staggering when presented in full context. Roughly 800 contaminated ampules dispersed across 14 months, casualty projections ranging from 247 confirmed deaths to possibly 400 when accounting for incomplete documentation, and documented evidence of severe injuries to at minimum 600 German military personnel. But even more striking than the raw statistics was the sophistication of Viktor's methodology, the manner he had exploited every vulnerability in the Nazi medical distribution framework, adapted his techniques based on operational feedback, and preserved security discipline that prevented discovery throughout 18 months of continuous activity. Military historians initiated, comparing his operation to legendary sabotage missions that had involved dozens of trained operatives and extensive support networks, observing that Viktor had accomplished comparable impact, working entirely alone with nothing more than his pharmaceutical understanding and access to a basement laboratory. Holocaust researchers seized on his story as an example of resistance that extended beyond the traditional narratives of armed partisans or hidden children, demonstrating that even within the totalitarian control frameworks of Nazi occupation, individuals with specialized understanding could conduct devastating asymmetric warfare. The moral dimension of Viktor's operation sparked intense debate within academic and philosophical circles, dividing scholars between those who celebrated his actions as justified retribution against genocidal evil and those who argued that deliberately inflicting torture, regardless of the objectives, represented a fundamental betrayal of medical ethics that could not be excused even by the extremity of the circumstances. Medical ethicists pointed out that Viktor had violated the foundational principle of his profession, the Hippocratic commitment to do no harm, transforming instruments of healing into weapons of suffering in manners that echoed the very atrocities committed by Nazi physicians in concentration camps. They argued that fighting monsters by evolving monstrous was not victory but surrender, that the moral high ground could not be claimed through methods that differed from Nazi brutality only in magnitude rather than nature. Defenders countered that applying peacetime ethical frameworks to the reality of industrial genocide was itself a form of moral blindness, that Viktor had been forced into an impossible situation where conventional resistance was unavailable and passive acceptance signified complicity in his personal destruction. They emphasized that his objectives were not civilian populations or random victims, but armed members of a military organization actively engaged in crimes against humanity, and that sabotaging enemy medical capabilities was a legitimate act of warfare, regardless of the particular methods employed. The debate remained unresolved, as such debates always do when confronting genuine moral complexity, but it guaranteed that Viktor's story would not fade back into obscurity. The true significance of Viktor Dankevych's operation, however, extended beyond casualty statistics or ethical arguments to something more fundamental about the nature of resistance under totalitarian frameworks. What Viktor had comprehended, perhaps intuitively rather than intellectually, was that the Nazis' greatest vulnerability was not military, but psychological. Their absolute conviction that the individuals they had conquered were too shattered, too terrified, or too inferior to pose a genuine threat. This assumption generated blind spots in their security apparatus, spaces where someone who appeared sufficiently defeated could function with relative freedom because the occupiers simply could not envision that such an individual remained dangerous. Viktor had weaponized his personal apparent powerlessness, had transformed the Nazis' contempt for him into operational advantage, had employed their blindness to generate a campaign of retribution that struck at the intimate moment when wounded soldiers anticipated relief and received instead a taste of the suffering they had imposed on millions. In accomplishing so, he had proven that resistance was possible even in the darkest circumstances, that a solitary individual, armed with understanding and determination, could impose meaningful destruction on a genocidal regime, and that the capacity for human agency persisted even when every external indicator suggested total domination. This lesson resonated far beyond the particular context of World War II, speaking to fundamental questions about power, resistance, and the indomitability of the human will to strike back against oppression regardless of the cost. The physical evidence of Viktor's operation, beyond the notebooks that documented his methodology, initiated emerging from unexpected origins in the late 1992. As the reunification of Germany led to more comprehensive archival investigation into wartime medical documentation, German historians working through previously inaccessible East German archives discovered case files from field hospitals that had treated wounded soldiers during the final years of the war, many of which contained detailed medical observations describing reactions to morphine that matched the manifestations of adder envenomation with disturbing exactness. One particularly haunting file from a hospital near Breslau contained hourly progress observations on a 23-year-old SS lieutenant who had been wounded by shrapnel during a Soviet artillery bombardment in January of 1942. The attending physician had documented the injection of morphine for pain management at 1400 hours, followed by notations that grew increasingly frantic as the patient's condition deteriorated in manners that contradicted every principle of pharmacology the physician comprehended. The patient reported that the pain had not diminished but intensified, that his complete body felt like it was being consumed by fire, that he could feel his blood turning toxic in his veins. The physician administered additional morphine, attempting to override what he presumed was an inadequate initial dose, which only magnified the suffering. By 1800 hours, the patient was experiencing convulsions, massive internal hemorrhaging, and what the observations described as psychological breakdown so complete that he was pleading to be executed. Death arrived at 2200 hours after 8 hours of documented torment, and the physician's final observation stated simply that he possessed no explanation for what had transpired and recommended inquiry into the medication inventory, a recommendation that was never implemented because the hospital evacuated 3 days later. Similar case files emerged from archives in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, each one documenting medical mysteries that had baffled German physicians, but which became instantly comprehensible when examined through the lens of deliberate poisoning. What made these documentation particularly valuable to historians was their unintentional testimony to the effectiveness of Viktor's operational security. In every solitary instance, the attending physicians attributed the adverse reactions to contaminated manufacturing batches, allergic responses, or unknown complications rather than sabotage. Not one German medical account from the complete war period suggested that morphine was being deliberately weaponized, which signified that Viktor's operation had succeeded not merely in generating casualties, but in remaining completely invisible to the adversary throughout its complete duration. This invisibility was perhaps his greatest accomplishment from a resistance perspective, because it signified the Nazis never possessed the opportunity to modify their security protocols, never followed the contamination back to particular distribution points, and therefore never prevented Viktor from continuing his work until the final days of the Reich. The wounded German soldiers who died screaming in field hospitals never understood they were casualties of a quiet pharmacist's vengeance, and the physicians who treated them never comprehended they were witnessing the consequences of transforming healing into warfare. The human dimension of Viktor's objectives became unavoidable as researchers initiated identifying particular individuals who had died from his contaminated morphine, moving the story beyond abstract casualty statistics into the realm of particular lives terminated in particular manners. Among the documented instances was a 19-year-old Wehrmacht corporal named Franz Becker, conscripted in 1944 from a farming family in Bavaria, wounded during the retreat from Ukraine, treated at a field hospital that received one of Viktor's deliveries, and dead within hours of morphine administration that converted his injury from survivable to fatal. There was Obersturmführer Karl Hoffmann, a 31-year-old SS officer who had participated in anti-partisan operations in Poland, wounded by a grenade fragment and subjected to 12 hours of escalating torment before dying in a field hospital outside Krakow. There was Hans Müller, 24, a medic who had ironically been wounded while treating other casualties and evolved into a victim of the very medical framework he served. Each identity represented a story, a family that received notification of death, a life trajectory terminated by Viktor's calculated intervention. These individual instances generated profound discomfort for some historians who had celebrated Viktor's operation in the abstract, but struggled when confronted with the particular reality of youthful men dying in extended torture, regardless of the uniforms they wore or the regime they served. The debate intensified around questions of collective guilt and individual responsibility. Were all German soldiers legitimate objectives for retribution given their service to a genocidal state? Or did the deliberate infliction of suffering on wounded individuals cross ethical boundaries that should remain inviolable even in total war? Viktor himself had anticipated these questions in his notebooks, though his answers provided little comfort to those seeking clear moral guidance. In entries composed during the final months of his operation, he acknowledged that many of his victims were likely conscripts rather than ideological Nazis, that some were probably decent individuals who had been swept into the Wehrmacht through circumstances beyond their control, that individualizing his objectives would make his work psychologically impossible. He composed that he had made a deliberate decision to view German soldiers not as individual humans, but as components of a machine that had slaughtered his family and millions of others, that this dehumanization was necessary for operational effectiveness, but arrived at the cost of his personal humanity. In one particularly revealing passage composed in March of 1945, Viktor observed that he comprehended future generations might judge him harshly for his methods, might perceive him as a torturer rather than a resistance fighter, and that he accepted this judgment as part of the cost he paid for his vengeance. He composed that he was not requesting comprehension or forgiveness, that he had made his choices with complete awareness of their moral weight, and that if his actions helped even marginally to undermine the Nazi war machine, then he considered the transaction acceptable, regardless of what it cost his essence. This unflinching self-awareness, the recognition that he was condemning himself through his personal actions, gave Viktor's story a tragic dimension that elevated it beyond simple tales of resistance, heroics into something more complex and more human. The cascade of archival revelations through the late 1992s and early 2000s gradually constructed a comprehensive picture of Viktor Danevych's operation that was more detailed and more disturbing than anyone had initially envisioned. The total casualty count, when all available evidence was compiled and analyzed, stabilized at roughly 293, confirmed deaths directly attributable to Viktor's contaminated morphine, with an additional 500 to 700 instances of severe injury, permanent disability, or psychological trauma resulting from the experience of being tortured by what they anticipated to be medicine. These figures positioned Viktor's solo operation among the most effective acts of individual sabotage in the complete European theater of World War II, comparable in impact to major partisan assaults or industrial sabotage operations that involved sophisticated networks and extensive planning. The geographic dispersal of his impact, stretching from Poland to Austria and touching field hospitals across hundreds of kilometers of battle lines, demonstrated a reach that appeared impossible for one individual working with minimal resources in basement laboratories. And the duration of his operation, 18 continuous months without discovery, despite operating within the highly controlled environment of Nazi pharmaceutical logistics, revealed a level of operational discipline and security consciousness that professional intelligence officers discovered remarkable. Viktor Dankevych had not merely been a resistance fighter. He had been a one-individual asymmetric warfare campaign operating at the intersection of medical understanding, chemical proficiency, and absolute determination forged in the furnace of personal loss. The story of Viktor Dankevych remains almost completely unknown outside specialized academic circles, absent from popular histories of World War II and unmentioned in most comprehensive accounts of resistance movements during the Nazi occupation. This obscurity is not accidental, but rather the result of deliberate choices made by governments and institutions that discovered his methods too morally complicated to celebrate, too dark to fit comfortable narratives about heroic resistance against evil. The Soviet Union buried his story because it emphasized individual action over collective struggle and involved a Jewish protagonist rather than communist partisans. Western historians overlooked it because weaponizing medicine violated ethical principles that transcended wartime necessity, because torture as resistance generated uncomfortable parallels with Nazi atrocities, and because acknowledging the effectiveness of such methods opened questions about the limits of acceptable warfare that remain unresolved. Viktor died anonymous and unmourned, his greatest accomplishment erased from history, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well in manners that challenged foundational assumptions about the rules of civilized conflict. His notebooks, finally declassified and available in Russian state archives, document a form of resistance that history has selected to forget, precisely because remembering it forces confrontation with truths about human nature and the costs of fighting absolute evil that remain too disturbing to integrate into heroic narratives of the war. Yet Viktor Dankevych's operation speaks to something fundamental about resistance under totalitarian frameworks that transcends the particular context of Nazi occupation and resonates across decades into our present moment. He proved that power, no matter how absolute it appears, always contains vulnerabilities that understanding and determination can exploit. He demonstrated that individuals retain agency even in circumstances designed to eliminate all possibility of effective resistance, that the capacity to strike back persists in the human spirit even when every external indicator suggests total domination. His weapon was not violence in the conventional sense, but rather the transformation of the adversary's personal frameworks against them, the employment of specialized understanding to generate suffering, where relief was anticipated, the weaponization of trust itself. This approach to resistance, operating within the oppressor's infrastructure rather than outside it, employing their assumptions and blind spots as operational advantages, remains relevant wherever totalitarian power seeks to crush human dignity and eliminate the possibility of defiance. Viktor's story is not a comfortable one, offers no easy moral lessons, and provides no template for heroism that can be celebrated without reservation. But it stands as permanent testimony that even in humanity's darkest hours, even when genocide operates with industrial efficiency, even when evil appears to have accomplished complete victory, a solitary individual with understanding and will can make monsters scream and prove that absolute power is always ultimately an illusion that collapses when confronted with the indomitable human refusal to submit.